Hey guys, welcome to this week's Money and Investing Show. This week we are looking at the topic of superannuation, a very important area for people to understand more about to make sure they're getting the best return and plotting out the best kind of retirement that they can expect. Make sure you take plenty of notes, and as always, make sure you take plenty of action. Hey guys, welcome to this week's Money and Investing Show with me, your host, Andrew Baxter, and as always, my co-host and offsider, Mitch Olarenshaw.
Thanks for having me on the show, Mr. Baxter. Now, the topic of conversation today is very clear. It's something that you're a lot closer to being able to access versus myself, but purely on the basis of our age. But I won't go into that. What we're talking about today is superannuation, the kinds and how to pick the right one for you.
It's an interesting one. Super, yes, it's one of those things I think as you're younger, you kind of put off and don't really want to spend any time thinking about because it would seem irrelevant in our youth. And as you get closer to that retirement age, for many people, it's something they obsess over because it's going to effectively have to fund their retirement. And I guess, the purpose for this podcast, I guess we'll talk about different types of super, what they're about, and hopefully give people some meat on the bone as to what pathways they could be taking to potentially improve where they're at. I guess, it's a really important thing, and it's something to not bury your head in the sand over because, one of those things in life is the earlier you get started, the earlier you get finished. And super is a really good example of that. So let's explore, see where we get with this.
That's right. Starting young, thinking long-term, right, makes all the difference. So if we I guess we could probably make this as practical as possible, AB. Let's talk about each group or kinds of supers, and then we can talk about exactly how they work, why they work, and what's involved with each of them. So probably the easiest would be just your defined contribution, so a percentage of your salary, right?
That's right. So current legislation, 10.5% for all of us, a little bit more for our politicians. I think it's 16.5% for our defence forces, and rightly so, I might add, for those guys. But 10.5% of your salary is your employee contribution to your super. It's legislated, and that number has changed quite considerably over time. So a defined contribution is where each month or each week that amount is added to your superannuation account. On the other side of the coin is something called a defined benefit. And you don't see too many of these anymore. They used to be quite prevalent a number of years ago, and they certainly remain prevalent in the public sector. Decide what you will off the back of that. And that's where you're guaranteed a percentage of your final salary. And that can become very attractive. If I take my father-in-law, for example, he was a teacher and happens to be on a defined benefit pension, one of the last of that group to go through. And so for him, he gets a percentage of what his final salary was. And I guess that can give you a level of certainty when it comes to retirement, and hence why they were quite popular. Where the shortcoming really sits for that type of super is that the income that's required to pay out the beneficiaries, the thousands of people that are on that deal, comes from the asset pool itself. And if markets aren't delivering those kind of returns, what then gets depleted in that asset pool is the capital value of it, because that needs to then be used to pass on as income. So it can leave more recent members or younger members in that scheme at a disadvantage compared to older members. My dad's on a defined benefit pension as well. That was what he put his money into. But again, if you're someone that comes into that scheme later and the scheme assets are smaller, then your probability of getting paid that are much lower.
Okay, so if you are on let's say a defined contribution, AB, and you're getting X% of your salary each week or month or whatever it is into superannuation, those funds are then obviously going somewhere, which would be, of course, either industry or retail super for the most part, right? Yeah,
the default for a lot of people would be, let's start with industry super. So industry super, if you're in the hospitality industry, it'd be Host Plus. If you're in construction, might be CBUS, and they're the ones that you often see the adverts for on the TV, where they're looking after their members' interests by investing in projects they build and things of that nature.
So this one, that symbol on the ads?
I think it may well be, actually. Yeah,
that symbol?
And that's nice. It's good to see.
It is. I watch ads a lot, actually. I actually really like them.
Impressive. I hadn't recalled that one, but there we go. You don't get those on the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills, which is usually my evening consumption.
You got to take control back of the remote.
I don't know about that. So industry super, it's a behemoth. When you think about it, it's around 33% of superannuation funds by funds under management are in industry super. And they provide a really good default for people to get their money going somewhere. Are they the best vehicle? Do their returns stack up? Do they give people the choices that they need? And are they run in the most efficient way? Well, they're a not-for-profit. So in that respect, the
should be a good thing, right?
It should be a good thing to reduce fees. Performance typically aren't so bad either when you look at them versus a retail super.
Are their fees really high? I've heard some controversial statements, not me making them, but hearing about them. Just in regards to fees they've been charging, miscellaneous type, is that right?
Yeah, there are a few issues there, and there was a Royal Commission not so long ago exploring in more detail some of the areas within particularly industry super that needed to be expanded upon. If your fund underperforms, for example, there's new legislation that means that you've got to write to your members and say, look, we're not doing a very good job. If you wanted to switch, we'd understand. And you can imagine that's a bit of a difficult message to send out, but nonetheless is one that's right. Some of the other areas of controversy, I suppose, within industry super, typically they're focused on quite unionized industries, and there are contributions from those industry supers to unions within that industry. And the question mark is the efficacy of that. Is it in everyone's best interest to be making multiple $million donations to a union out of effectively a pension fund?
Which, assuming you don't get to choose which unions that donation goes to either, right?
So, that sort of stuff there is prompted controversy, and I guess it gives pundits like us the opportunity to try and shoot them down. Industry super funds play a very, very important role in the economy. It means that people that are in a job are contributing towards their retirement, which for my mind is a massive plus. So there are benefits. People are contributing towards their retirement. It's the default typically. There are shortcomings, there are flaws, fee structure being one, and I guess some of the internal machinations of how donations are made might be another one for people, but nonetheless they do provide a massively important role in there to get people started. But it's rather like when you start in the workforce, you might start with a part-time job, but that doesn't mean to say that's what your career is going to be. And I think over time, as you become perhaps a little bit more sophisticated or more knowledgeable with what other kinds of investments are out there, you may then choose to migrate to other types of funds over time.
Let's talk about that now. Industry super fund, by the way, for our listeners, around 1.1 trillion worth in Australia. It's massive.
Absolutely. And I think I'm right in saying this. I should have checked these stats, but it would be the biggest by volume of members too, because
yes,
there are a lot of lower income earners that are in there. If you think about Host Plus in the hospitality industry, would be a good example of that. So that by membership base, it'd be probably the biggest as well.
Let's chat now about retail super funds, AB. So this is about 20% or so of the overall the market of
superannuation market,
superannuation market,
the big supermarket.
The supermarket in Australia. What are your thoughts there on retail super?
Look, typically, if you've sat down with a financial planner, you're going to be probably guided towards a retail super of some sort, and that might be the sort of thing that's provided by no particular order, a company like MLC or Colonial or AMP, where your money is then directed into a fund that they look after. And I guess the attraction for retail super is that it gives the investor a little bit more choice as to where that money is being directed. So rather than being in a default industry super fund, you might choose to have some stuff that's a little bit more spicy and colourful, more conservative, more environmentally friendly if you've got an ESG bias, for example, and you get to make those choices through retail super. They're typically associated with a platform where the financial planner's got all your assets on the one platform, which means, unfortunately, as per the financial planning industry, you might be tied to that particular planner's approved product list, so it might be a little bit more narrow than the full gambit of the market. But again, it gives that sense of control to people, which I think is very important, and particularly given the fact that it's your money, so you do want to have some control over where it's going. There are some downsides there. Fee structure-wise, can be a little bit expensive, especially when you dial in, whatever your financial planner might be charging you for the initial advice, revisions to advice, your ongoing fees, funds under management trails. So the fees can build up a little bit in that respect, but you do have that element of choice and control as to where your money is being deployed. So it does fit a valuable space. Again, the Royal Commission came out and pointed to some fairly significant deficiencies in the retail super land based on some of the fees for no service and different things of that nature that were well documented through that. So it's not without its flaws either. And I guess it's like everything, depending on the set of lenses that you want to put on, you can take pot shots at everybody, but there are some good aspects to it too. So in just the same way that industry super is great to get people preparing for their their future on a fairly passive basis. Retail super gives people a little bit more control. So I guess it's a move further down the line for people that want to have a little bit more control.
Personally on that, it's funny you say this. Recently, I did a bit of a spring clean of some of the stuff I've got going on, and I did exactly that. Went into my retail super and changed the asset allocation to a higher growth, higher risk.
Which is exactly as it should be for your age group. And it can be, and it's one of the things we'll probably talk to when it comes to, money maintenance in one of these episodes, I'm sure, that it is important to revisit where your asset allocation mix might sit, which, if you say you're getting advice from mum and dad, and I mean, your dad's a great guy to have a bit of advice on most things in life with, but he's done well financially, so he'd have some great advice for you in terms of what to do. The challenge is that he's looking through lenses that are obviously of a different generation to you from an age perspective, and so he may be more conservative than where you should be. So it's very, very important to make sure you're looking through the right lens for you at the right stage of the journey, that's for sure.
Well, speaking of absolute control for the most part, AB, let's now dive down further to self-managed super funds, or SMSFs, as they're commonly referred to as. Just for the benefit of our listeners, for anyone out there who may actually not be aware of what an SMSF is, how do they work?
Okay, so a self-managed super fund is where you're the beneficiary. You're also the director and trustee of that fund as well. So effectively, you get to make all of the decisions over your retirement. And I've seen an awful lot of people get set up with a self-managed super that have got no business being in an SMSF for a couple of reasons. Number one, their account balance may be too low, or number two, their skill set or desire to want to manage it are a misfit. So right off the bat, self-managed super is not for everybody. You need to have an interest in managing it, because you are going to have to do that ultimately, and you are going to need a minimum balance to make it cost effective. And no one, when you go online, you look around, no one's ever going to tell you, this is what you should have. I'm going to put a ballpark figure out there, and I'm going to say 250 grand is probably the minimum balance. You can start with a smaller balance, but that's probably the threshold where
combined,
it starts to make sense.
In a household?
And I appreciate, exactly right. So I think, for some people, they might go, I wish I had 250 grand in my super. But the great thing about self-managed super is that you can have up to 6 members of that. So that could be you and your partner and your 4 kids, if you've got 4 kids. One of mine's going to miss out, but I'm sure they'll get looked after in a different way, given we've got 5 kids. But if you then combine the value of your partner and your super together, it probably should be over 250 grand. And if it's not, well, that's a very good reason to not be using the facility you currently are, because it's clearly not performing. If you've been working for 20 plus years, and I appreciate one of you may have taken time off for a family, but if you've been working for 20 plus years and your super hasn't got up to that level, it's not going to get you to where you need to be in retirement either. So it's time to take steps. So about 250, get yourself, when you get up and running with that, effectively the structure that you have a corporate, you set up a company which is the trustee for the superannuation fund. The assets are then held within the super. You have total control with what you're doing within there. Get advice on this. Talk to your accountant, particularly as to the suit, and your planner and or accountant as to the suitability of this for you. But you get that ability to have absolute control. And one of the areas I've seen a lot of people go to for self-managed super, and I don't necessarily think it's right, depends on their circumstance, is that ability to buy a property or properties within their super. So you can borrow within a superannuation fund. A lot of people don't realise you can do that. Yeah. So it's, there's a process behind this. We're not going to get into the nuts and bolts of that in this podcast, but it's something called a LRBA, which is a limited recourse borrowing agreement, which gives you the ability to borrow within your super to purchase a property.
All right.
So, given property has been a big store of asset for many, many people, and the property market overall has performed reasonably well, you'd argue that it's probably a good place. Some of the rules within super is you can't live in that property. There's an overarching directive for superannuation called the sole purpose test, which means if you hold an asset within super, its sole purpose is to fund your retirement. If you happen to live in that house, it's a conflict of interest. It doesn't meet the sole purpose test, so you can't live in the house that you own within your super.
So if you've bought some, let's say some collector's wine, for example, or maybe some art, sole purpose test, you can access your super at what, 55, 65, thereabouts, depending on your circumstances?
Depending on when you've hit preservation age, 55 to 60, yeah. 65.
Can you then go and start cracking into those bottles of wine at 65?
Well, again, if you've got wine, stamps, artworks and things like that, they've got to be stored off-site. You can't keep them in your house and enjoy the benefits of a Van Gogh or a Matisse hanging on the wall. It's got to be stored somewhere that's not in your house for as a point. Now, I guess over the years, the ATO have done a very good job of managing the fun out of this, but it is important. It is there for a reason. So self-managed super is about 26% of the market, but when you look at the proportion of the population that are involved with it, the actual member number is relatively low compared to industry super, but the average balance is significantly higher. So they tend to be used by people that are a little bit more wealthy, and so the numbers are then skewed accordingly. And look, if it's a fit for you, I think having, and as someone that's been at the sort of vanguard of financial literacy now for a couple of decades, if the shoe fits, I'd definitely put it on. If you've a desire to have more control over your future and you've been educated on how to invest or some of the processes that are required for super, I think self-managed super is the place that you ought to be, because you're ultimately in control of your own destiny there. The latitude that it then gives you in terms of your investment landscape that you can put money into, and to give some examples of that, if you're someone that perhaps is, I'll give you an example of a buddy of mine. So he's got a self-managed super. The self-managed super owns a yard. His business requires a yard for the various machinery and plant and equipment that he has for his business. So his business rents the yard off his super. Now, that's entirely legitimate, provided it's documented and you're charging the going rate in terms of the rent, but you've got the ability to get a tax deduction within your company, because rent is a tax deduction payable into your super, which is a low tax environment, and you've got an ability to then build an asset. Again, you've got to get advice on this sort of thing, and it's not about the rich getting richer and playing the system. They're the rules. We're just simply playing within the rule book, and they're the sorts of things that you can start to explore, and they're quite commonly used. Get advice on it, make sure you don't tread over the line, and you always do the right thing. The other advantages of being able to bring your kids in, because from a succession planning perspective, it can then be a very, very good asset protection vehicle that lends itself well then to succession planning as well. So pretty important.
Speaking of which, chat to that now. 3, I guess, key elements I want to ask you on all of this, AB: taxation, asset protection, and succession planning. How do those 3 fit into these kinds of different structures?
Look, super is taxed at 15%. That's the tax rate within super. So that's across, and that's ubiquitous across all of those different structures. You can pay more into your super, but there are various tax rules in Australia. If you earn over a certain amount, then what you then put into your superannuation becomes taxed at your marginal rate, which is a little unfair, but that's just the way the system is. 27 and a half grand, I think, is the current contribution cap in terms of concessional contribution that you can put in. Again, these things will change over time. So again, it's always good to get advice, but 15% tax rate is what makes super relatively appealing compared to pretty much everything else that you could do in our country. Second part to that, in terms of asset protection, the assets in a super fund belong to the super fund itself, not the individuals, because a super fund is its own legal entity. So if you were to have a self-managed super fund with your retirement savings in there and various other things, and you were to get sued, those assets aren't your personal assets. And so if somebody is suing you personally, they can sue you for your personal assets, but super is external to that. It's, however, subject to family law. So if you're going through a separation, superannuation is typically something that will sit within the asset pool there. So there is a distinction from that perspective. And then succession planning is, if you have an asset that you want to keep in your family over a period of time in a low risk structure, then self-managed super can be a great way to do that. So, got an example of that as a client that owns a shopping mall. Okay. And the kids are in there. It's a great renter. They don't want to sell it, and it just sits in there, and it's just going to pass on that way.
It sounds like a fairly effective vehicle overall, super, really, doesn't it? Particularly self-managed super fund for middle to high income earners over time.
Yeah. I think, again, and I'll be very careful with this, given obviously some mainstream broadcast going out to an awful lot of people, and there's no one size fits all with this kind of thing. You've got to work out what's right for you at a given time. And I think, if you look at the 5 or 6 phases of life, in the earlier phases, just getting started is the most important thing to do. And then that middle phase is starting to consider your structuring to be more efficient and effective. There's no point considering how to be more efficient and effective if you haven't started. So getting into whatever a default super may look like for you, whether that be an industry super, and we haven't talked about corporate supers, for example, or government ones for that matter either. So if you work for certain companies, big companies, Qantas might be an example of that. They have their own internal superannuation fund for their staff, and they can be very, very tax effective, and they can be very, very good for their members. And I think if you work for a good quality company that has a well-regarded corporate super fund, that can be a brilliant place to get started and really start to build your asset base up. And I'm a huge advocate. I've seen numerous corporate schemes, and they typically work very, very well for the members, which is brilliant. The alternatives to that are some of the government supers out there, and we haven't talked about that yet. It's a bit of a prickly area for some people, particularly our politicians who get additional amounts of contribution to their super, which seems rather unjust, but that's just the way of the world right now. Where I think some of those government type supers can be excellent, if we look at our Defence Force super here in Australia, for example, I think it's a 16.5% contribution for our men and women in our Defence Forces. And some people may look at that and go, well, that's a little unfair. It should be the same for everyone. And I'd argue that may well be the case. But I think at the same time, the men and women that serve for our country deserve a lot more than what they get. And I think it's great to see those Defence Force superannuation funds running in the way that they do. So they're unique outliers from the big three, but nonetheless, they're important ones. So sometimes there can be some big benefits to being in a government super. Police officer would be another example of that, where it makes sense to keep that there. But once you maybe finish in that industry, you might then look to other channels. So that might be great to get started. But as your level of knowledge and understanding changes, then there are other pathways that you can then go down as well. Key thing within super also is to understand about insurances, because superannuation funds carry, for a lot of people, their life insurance and also TPD, total permanent disability insurance. And so before you go changing anything, it's very, very important to make sure that you get advice on how that's going to affect your insurance too, because and there have been instances, I know people have gone online and tried to do it on the cheap and set up an online self-managed super fund, and they've then got the self-managed super fund set up and they do a rollover and pull all the cash out of their industry fund or their retail fund, only to not be aware of the fact that their life insurance is also cancelled after they've rolled all their funds out, and they're left without any life insurance, and they don't work that out until a little bit too late in the piece. So it's very, very important to get a good advice on these sorts of things. The key thing, to go back to it, is you have to have the easiest possible low friction way of getting started with any kind of investment. Just the same way when we talk about opening a broking account, get open your own name, work out how it works, and then you might set up a company or a trust down the line, but get started. So whatever it takes to get started, industry or retail. And then over time, as your level of sophistication and life circumstances change, then you can revisit this. And life circumstances are really what financial planning is all about. You know, as a bachelor, as you are currently, it may change, I'm sure, by the time this episode gets published.
Come on.
But, you know, as a bachelor, you're a lone wolf right now. And I've lived in that lane for an awful long time of my life in that lane. And so you haven't had to worry about anything else. But then, as your circumstances change, maybe you get married and you have a family, by being able to pull your assets and do a rollover and set up a family super starts to become the next obvious thing along the chain. But that's then not necessarily now. Key thing is get started, understand where you're at, and then over time morph things through so that it's in the optimal structure that suits you and what your objectives really sit at.
Beautiful, AB. Well said. Couldn't have said it any better myself. There it is. Superannuation ticked off the list. Beautiful.
Super, super, super. Love it.
Super effort. Thanks, AB.
Cheers, Mitch. There you have it, guys. Make sure you give us a review and a rating, and we'll look forward to hosting you next week.